Professor Jerry Kang, without further ado, thank you for joining us today. And I have to start with a burning question I'll ask on behalf of college students, but also on behalf as a parent of college students. What does higher education look like today? And we get to have your perspective as a leader in that space. So we'd love to hear it.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And Jeanie, sorry for interrupting, but of course, the last thing that people want to hear is an endless list of vita. I am an academic. I'm also a senior administrator at UCLA. I'm a parent. I've got a kid who had her freshman year rudely interrupted, like many of you. And I have to say, higher education is going through a lot. I think the hardest question is, as you recall, many of you recall, we had to shut down campuses pretty quickly. It was a lot of anxiety, and to try to do that residential living on campuses, to do that in a sensible way that was mindful of the risks, but also recognized the amount of burden that it would place on people. And some people could bear it very easily. Other people, it was really, really hard. That was a real challenge. And then it turns out turning things off is much harder than turning things on. And the question is, what do we do in the fall to turn things on? So all of you, this is top of mind. If you're a student, if you have siblings who are students, your parents are concerned about this. The question presented is, hey, are we going to have a residential college experience, or are you all going to be attending University of Zoom with the footnote, branded UCLA, UC Berkeley, wherever you might be at any given time? I think that's the challenge. And I can talk more about it, but that's the really hard question, because you should view every university as like a small city state. And the question is, when you bring a lot of people onto a city state, what are the expectations? How do we actually play that game when we have so much uncertainty? And that's what we're all struggling with. And I'm happy to go into greater details, Jeanie.
Well, I think we'll have time for Q&A later, but I think that's still a burning question. You shared some on your end. There's so much uncertainty. College students are scrambling. We can only imagine what colleges are doing. I think what's the first, top priority for colleges? Safety, yes, but what is the thing that you guys are really focused on?
Yeah. So, in some ways, part of getting an education is figuring out what the deal is. I often tell people, what's the deal? And it sounds kind of anti-intellectual, but that's the point of an education, figure out what the deal is. And oftentimes you learn different techniques to actually understand different kinds of problems. So this thing called the university, even though you're marinated in it when you're actually going to college, you don't realize that in some sense it's an entity, whether it's a corporate entity, a nonprofit entity. It has an underlying economics. You got to put dollars in and dollars go out. It has an underlying physical infrastructure. It lives and breathes. Water flows through it. Pipes can break. There's a whole bunch of things where, again, if you study basic economics, if you study basic politics, if you study basic communications, psychology, there's a whole bunch of ways to understand this thing called the university. So the hardest question is, can we pull off residential living? What does that look like? So there are all these constraints, right? Think about what a state says. Well, think about what our nation says, but think about what a state says. Think about what a county public health department says. And then how do you actually bring human beings back onto the dormitories or residential life? And so it's mostly what we're trying to figure out is the safety side. Does density matter, right? How many human beings can you put into a room? Is it really all about shared bathrooms? And does cleaning, 3 times a day actually help? There are other things, right? Is it helpful to have really good testing? Do we actually have really good testing? Could you possibly test students often enough? You probably have to test them ideally, once every 3 days? Can you actually get that to scale? Currently, there's no way. It costs $70. Labs are hard to find. Can you find new technologies of multiplexing tests so that you could test whole vats at a time and then reverse engineer any positives? Think about all the other things. When you see infrared guns on people's forehead to check their temperature, is that like going through TSA security? Is it just theater to make you feel better when it actually does nothing, because the truth is we're generally asymptomatic spreaders. It could be that, again, IR thermometers are terribly inaccurate with wild variations. If you actually do that and try to keep people out of the dining hall, what happens when someone's on an edge, 100.3 versus 100.2, it's going back and forth, and some security guard lets a buddy in but stops another guy. The buddy happens to be white. The guy he stops happens to be black, when safe distancing is actually enforced in subjective ways. So there's a whole bunch of just mechanics of how to create systems that are genuinely safe, that do not materially increase the risk of harm to all of you compared to the base rate that you would experience in your own homes and other neighborhoods. At the same time, partly my job is to think about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And if you don't bake in, again, what it means to have fair processes and to recognize the predictable errors that humans just make because we see friend and foe, we exercise discretion in ways that tend to break in favor of the people we like. If you don't bake in good practices early on, then inevitably they'll fail. And when they fail, they oftentimes fail catastrophically. And so those are some of the questions we're thinking through, ranging from, again, PCR, to having masks, to branding them in a particular kind of way that creates an identity that allows all of us to actually feel comfortable about wearing masks, all the way to making sure that we're fully inclusive when we reopen.
Yeah, because you from the angle of the students, most students have this anxiety going on. They've lost a chunk of their semester, their entire summer. The fall is still up in the air. Is that on the same end as well for administrators and professors? How's the anxiety level?
Yeah, I think there's a huge. Well, look, let's. You don't want to create equivalencies where they don't exist. People who are more. The truth is, everyone suffers anxiety because we don't know stuff. And just a footnote. Just newsflash. If you thought somehow administrators knew stuff and they just weren't telling you, in a semi off the record kind of comment, and no such thing exists on the internet. The truth is, administrators are just people like you who've just grown up a little bit older and have slightly better clothing. So the point is, there are a lot of people who have no idea what's going to happen. And the same reasons why you're anxious because we have lack of good information actually applies to us. Now, that said, because we're making decisions, the act of agency allows us to manage that stress a little bit more. It has had a huge impact. But like faculty are anxious, right? Because you got a bunch of older faculty who are older than 65. They don't know what they're doing. Like they can bet, many of them can barely answer emails, much less, start teaching on Zoom. And you've experienced this, no doubt, where people seem awkward in their ability to use communications. But faculty are anxious. You've got staff who are anxious, who think that they're going to be furloughed and fired. And so there is a lot of anxiety. So I guess what I want to share with you is maybe your university has been terrific at communicating with you. Transparency is a real good value, and learning more is almost always helpful. Maybe they've been terrible. Maybe they've been spamming your email inboxes with stuff that you don't even need to read because it doesn't help you understand. But I guess what I want to share is that rarely is it because the people in charge know what they're going to do. They just don't want to tell you. Almost always it's because they're trying to figure things out. And there's a lot of moving pieces. And there's a lot of reasonable, sort of expectations that they're trying to navigate. So there is a lot of fear. I do think that soon, just by force of just the timeline, most people will get slightly better information about whether colleges and universities will try to start back in residence. It will be, again, much less dense. They're going to have to do stuff to actually decrease density in the classroom. They're going to, again, do all kinds of things that will make it an awkward experience. Even if you are back on campus, much of it, many things will feel still remote. You'll be Zooming from your rooms sometimes for large lecture halls and other kinds of things. That's inevitable. And the real challenge is what happens when the first 3 COVID positive cases hit in the dormitories. And if the huge pressure and the anxiety from parents will lead to a domino effect where one university then shuts down, then another university shuts down, and then everyone is sent back. I think that's the open challenge.
Well, you just touched on that, of course, because as any parent would worry about their kids. I think the other thing that's a huge part of the summer is that students have lost internships, job opportunities, experiences. It's we're about to enter the summer. What's something you could share with them that would help them figure out how to spend their summer?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question, and I want to be rightfully, I don't know, humble or modest about what I can say. If I give advice to my 19-year-old daughter, she might just look at me. It's like you sound like an old man. You sound like that's like a dad joke. I mean,
I get it.
really, you want me to glow up? So there are. So I want to be humble. Each of you have a lifetime worth of experience. Many of you heard, I think, terrific advice from a lot of people over the course of the day. And I do not want to suggest that simply because I've been alive a little bit longer and have a little more experience, that I have the right answers by any stretch. Now, that said, I mean, I could tell you what I would do and what's important to me and how to do it. So a couple things off the top of my head that no doubt have been reinforced today. Number one, I think it is important not to lose hope. I already heard a little bit about reminding yourself of the resilience that our people have shown over history. So you come from a long line of immigrants and Koreans who, yeah, I mean your parents you yourself or your parents' parents, they crossed the freaking ocean with far more risk. There's a lot of resilience within the Korean people. There's a lot of, again, suffering. There's a lot of Han as well. But strength is something, and perseverance is something that is, I don't like to say this often, that is part of our DNA. So I'm asking you not to lose hope. Number two, I think it's really important always to act. So this is the idea of either whether I just like exercising your agency. If you study sociology, there's always this balance between structure and agency. Structure is all the other stuff out there that like constrains you, binds you because there's culture and economics and politics and prevents you from being able to do what you want to do. Agency, on the other hand, emphasizes that you can actually act even when you're bound in so many different ways. There are whole different interesting ways where you can exercise your agency. And there is some self-fulfilling prophecy about this orientation to just brutally just act. The world doesn't happen to you. In some ways, you write your own narrative. And I think if you remember that you're not just an object, but always also a subject, it gives you a certain kind of moral agency and responsibility. So I want you to act like every day, know that you're making decisions, choices, acting. And generally speaking, when you take that mindset, I think people do better with, again, stress. Connected with that, then you have to just be mindful of kind of what's in your control. Sometimes people talk about spheres of control. You might care about a lot of things, but right now you might not be actually designing the vaccine. So what can you control in your sphere? And that sphere, I mean, if you think really just spatially, it could be you and your room. It could be your family, your institution, your city, all the way up to larger and larger places. But part of it is figuring out what is my sphere of control. And it might be that right now, like, if I had to live back in college, like the idea of going back home and living in college indefinitely would have been really, really hard for me. I just want to confess that. And so it might be that your sphere of control just might be just yourself, your mind, and your small room. But trying to figure out what it is you can actually change and then working in that sphere is really important. The final thing is that, you know, it sounds so trite to say, oh, learn a language, do other kinds of stuff. But I do think preparing is a good way to think about it. I think it's important to prepare. It means as you have time and as you again find some way to manage and muddle through kind of the anxiety of the time, you have to continue preparing. And I think whether it's building up knowledge or building up skills or almost like creating a body of work. If you're a writer, I think it's important to write. If you're a designer, I think it's important to design. And many of you are talented in the design space that is principally digital, such that you can actually create things. I think it would be really interesting to challenge yourself. What will be my body of work that I've created during the summer of COVID-19? When people ask, what did you do? And of course you can say, like, yeah, I streamed a lot of shows. But the point is, in some sense, is there a body of work? And it doesn't have to be the most instrumental. It doesn't have to be, oh, I prepped for these classes and I already did that. There has to be something that you've created. And I think the idea that you can point to something that you've created during that time, even if you didn't have an internship I think might be really useful to you. And so that's what I would recommend trying to figure out. What is within your control, within that sphere? And then can you create something like a body of work?
I love that. I was going to say, I can just already think even professionals can do that too. With some of us who aren't traveling or we're working from home. And then I guess I have to ask this question because before we actually open up to Q&A, is your vice chancellor of diversity, equity, and inclusion. When students go back, what's it going to look like for Asian Americans? We're right now stuck at home. We're not in the school space. It's going to be a different experience. I believe they will go back. That's just my thought. What are some things that they can prepare for? We talked a lot about resilience today, courage, vulnerability. I would love your just your perspective on that. How you can best tell kids to prepare in the things that they might be experiencing. On that note.
Yeah, so generally the rule is eyes wide open. Like you never want to go into a terrain just clueless. Part of being smart, and you're all blessed with smarts, either because of hustle or even though you never worked a day in your life, you're all quite talented. The point is, you want to go into any kind of new environment eyes wide open. Like don't be clueless. That is part of what it means to have an education and to actually have a working brain. So when you go into that, you have to think about the we've done this before, is what I want to try to suggest. And what I mean by that is, abstractly speaking, when you have an exogenous shock to the system, a lightning bolt hits an equilibrium, then something rattles. And whenever things rattle, like a society, predictably, there's a divide between us and them, between in-groups and out-groups. So a global pandemic, right? A crisis, immigration patterns, whatever it is, right? When that exogenous shock hits a system, the system almost always breaks to in-groups and out-groups. And people in charge and with power naturally gravitate to the in-group, and then they want to actually push out the out-group. Why? Because just like people protect their own families more than other people's families, that's a natural way that human beings actually operate. And Asians have historically been viewed in a particular light. I mean, Koreans, East Asians. So think about it, right? At the end of the 19th century, that's when we pass our first race-based federal exclusion laws in immigration. It's the Chinese Exclusion Acts. We viewed the Chinese principally as an invading horde. We needed them for their labor, but then when they stuck around, they debased white labor because, they would be willing to do stuff that white folks wouldn't properly do. They were viewed as unfair competitors who would do anything just to survive. I just think about Asians in the library, that you're studying too much to outcompete. And moreover, they were viewed as foreign and, again, in sometimes filthy and a disease vector. So it happened with the Chinese. That's why we passed laws both under the guise of labor as well as health crisis and other things to quarantine them and to exclude them. It also happened, I mean, if you think about it, the Japanese American internment. So in World War II, if you think about what happened, is you had, again, an exogenous shock, literally Pearl Harbor, right? And Pearl Harbor has been mentioned with COVID-19 and 9/11 by our own Surgeon General as the kinds of things that have shocked our system. So at that point, how do people respond? Of course, there's private violence in overreaction, but there's also state violence in the form of racial profiling, right? Because they're viewed as foreign, as inherently and incorrigibly foreign, and therefore a threat to national security because they might side with Japan. And you have 120,000 people of Japanese descent who are actually locked up for an average of almost 3 years. 2/3 of them were American citizens because they were born on American soil, and the 14th Amendment guarantees citizenship. The other third were not American citizens, but it's in part because at that time, they didn't let Asians naturalize, right? By force of law, unless you were white or black, you could not naturalize to become a U.S. citizen. Koreans couldn't naturalize until 1952. I mean, most people are shocked when they find out about that. The reason why I go through this history lesson is there are examples where exogenous shocks lead people to think about us versus them, a desire to scapegoat them, think of others as foreign, fungible, and then so all the benefits to insiders we take seriously. All the costs inflicted on outsiders, well, that doesn't even show up on the spreadsheet, right? So if I can do things that help me, even if it hurts you, well, who are you? You're not part of my people, my tribe. You don't belong. So that is predictably what happens, both privately and publicly. And so that's what I mean by eyes wide open. So when you go back into public spaces, if you deal with a jerk who says something because you're wearing a mask, these are things that you're going to have to confront. The final thing that I'll say, and we can talk more about solutions, but I know I've been prattling on. The final thing I'll say is that oddly enough, the fact that it is now increasingly a genuine pandemic across the entire globe means that the information that we're constantly receiving less and less tightly associates the disease with Asian faces, right? It's Italian faces, it's New Yorkers, it's a different kind of association that our neural networks are training on. So it's hard to view it solely as an Asian phenomenon because we see so many examples that look different. That said, having very powerful people constantly hammer on on it being China and China's fault and the WHO's fault and the WHO is staffed by someone who has brown skin. That kind of language threatens, again, what it means to be part of the American fold. So being mindful of in-groups and out-groups, and we're all responsible for that. And we do that as well. Like, no one's innocent. Like, you're part of the problem, just like I am. I think that's what we want to be mindful of.
I actually love that you said that. I was going to say, so you're on campus and you're a professor on campus. What do you like to see students doing in the face of what we're dealing with today? I mean, as someone who's who works with students, and we talk a lot about empathy, resilience, all this stuff. But as we build a community, especially Asian Americans, what do you hope to see yourself when you're on the college campus?
Um, I have to admit, it sounds really, I don't know, trite or modest. Here's what I really like. I like smarts. I really do like smarts. What I mean, but I don't mean smarts always in just book smarts. I mean smarts in the sense of knowing what the deal is, not being so deluded so you don't know what you don't know. So I mean self-awareness. I mean kind of, emotional intelligence, but I really treasure smarts. If you actually have a brain, you have an ethical obligation to use it. If you say dumb things and you know they're dumb, that's on you. And you have a job to actually improve what you can or cannot do. I mean, that is the point of an education. The second thing that I really like is I actually like, and it's weird because I'm kind of a hard ass, but I like kindness. I like people who have an open heart. So I think it's wrong to think that the only way you can show like a brutal intelligence is to cut people down. And at an earlier time in my life, when I was closer to your age, that's how I understood intelligence. That's how I understood smarts. I could be quite cutting. And I thought that's how you demonstrate what it means to be smart. And I think that's profoundly mistaken. I think the best way to express any set of talents and skills is actually through a certain kind of kindness. All this ties together with, I think, the theme of what I mean by in-group and out-group. You will have constant choices, right, in every day, whether in some ways you're part of the problem or part of the solution. Asian Americans historically have always been a liminal minority. We can either identify upwards as honorary whites or downwards as people of color within a racial hierarchy. It turns out when someone with privilege and goodies invites you into their club, it's hard to say no. Like, why would you say no? They got good stuff, right? I get that. And I'm not trying to caricature all white people as doing this way, but I'm focusing on racial hierarchy. But I've always actually chosen to identify as a person of color because I think the history of America, even though I'm fiercely individualistic, is that our fates are linked as a function of things like race and racism. And I want people always to be mindful of the choices that they're making. And for me, anytime I have a possibility of either letting the division happen or to try to embrace each other as a common in-group, I always try to be mindful of picking the choice that creates a larger in-group. And so as you enter those folds, those conflicts, those decision points, I just want you to think about, is what you just saw, maybe some comment made by someone else or something that, a pattern of behavior that you see from another person on a Zoom call or a professor, Is that pushing people to the margins or pulling people into the mainstream, into the center? And I think the more we can pull people into a common in group, the more it humanizes all of us and recognizes that we're all into it together. So that's what I encourage you to think about.
Because you made me think of something, the bystander effect. Just how what are your thoughts on that and how people can address that? Because there's sometimes we want to say something or kids want to say something, but then they don't. They say it happened, and then they get because I see that I work with a lot of college kids. I see them very stressed because they feel like they can't say something. Someone's not wearing a mask. They're they have their own thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah. It turns out even though lots of people, here's my experience, at least as an administrator, even though lots of people sometimes talk a big game, it turns out no one actually likes conflict. Even the strongest, most powerful people, it turns out everyone's conflict averse. No one wants a hard conversation. No one wants a hard day. No one wants a physical confrontation. Even the big burly folks who think, they're all talk. I mean, no one likes conflict, right? And that's what I realized because I viewed myself as, oh, I can. Yeah. Turns out I don't like conflict either. And so you're like everyone else to the extent that if you didn't want to jump right in, that's number one. So we're more similar than different. Number two is how we're recognizing that there's real value to actually interrupting or confronting, especially if you're acting as an ally. Sometimes if some other person, like a Latinx person, is treated differently because of his immigration status. I mean, Koreans are immigrants, right? I mean, that's who we are as a people. Your ability to step in and say, I'm the face of immigration as well, actually pivots and changes things because it seems less like just a defensive argument that pursues self-interest. It's actually an argument more on the merits because you are viewed as a little bit more neutral or objective or less invested. Regardless of whether you are, that's how you are viewed. So actually interrupting, especially when it's not directly about you, oftentimes is a good thing. Now, two more points on this. When you actually interrupt, and I'm just being just instrumental here, there's two different ways to do it. Some social psychologists talk about autonomy constraining ways or autonomy promoting ways. Autonomy constraining ways is kind of like saying, you shouldn't have done that. You violated a norm, and so you're both a bad person and you should be held accountable and punished. Okay. An autonomy promoting way, it might sound just like it's softer, but it says it's less about you, and it's more about I. This is what I heard, and I'm going to share with you some information. And I know you have these values. Given the new information that I've given to you, I think you should reconsider, right, what you said and why. I mean, maybe this is what you want to do, but I'm just asking you to make sure even though it's just, maybe stylized, you might think one's just more tough and one's a little softer. I think generally when people are called out, and this is the danger with call out culture, usually you get something called reactance. People get pissed off, they get defensive, they dig their heels in. And sometimes you have to call people out because they've gone completely beyond the pale. But a lot of mistakes are just that, mistakes. And I oftentimes encourage both interruption, but also always done in a way that gives them a way out, to say that they didn't know, that it's really just a factual omission, or they didn't appreciate it emotionally, but they've learned something and they don't need to die on that hill. They don't need to pick that fight. They actually agree with you that allowing something like a graceful exit for someone who's made a problematic comment oftentimes helps build a certain kind of community. So that's the other point. Like, again, it's also trendy to engage in cancel culture, call out culture, to think that righteousness is the only way to express one's moral virtue. And especially, and it's just a demographic truth that right now, as you're feeling your own agency, it's most natural. Indeed, if you did not feel in some cases the most righteous now, then like you're missing something because as you get older, it becomes more gray everywhere. Everything becomes more complex. You become more Hamlet-like on the one hand, on the other hand, to be or not to be. So I understand and value the kind of righteousness that you might experience. But I want you to be mindful and maybe temper some of the righteousness with the possibility of grace. If you show no grace, if you show no possibility of how we can muddle through together, then we're just going to reinforce in groups and out groups. There will be no possibility of crossing that bridge. So I want you to think about opening yourself to that approach as well.
Thank you. So I was told that we do have to wrap up, but I have to have you share this because you shared this with me when I spoke to you about students and how they view real life. I would like for you to end on that note, and what you shared really resonated. I would love everyone to hear this.
Yeah. I hinted at this a little bit earlier about the nature of administrators. And don't get me wrong, many administrators are incredibly good. I work with extraordinary colleagues, enormously talented and committed. But I remember when I was a student, whether it's high school to college to law, I just assumed when there were kind of like petty fights amongst like student organizations or like between study mates, I was just like, I was so tired of the drama. I said like, oh my Lord, why are we so incompetent and like biting at each other and all? And I just said, when I become an adult, when I enter the real world, all this nonsense will end and everything will just work. And I thought I was practicing for real life, that college was just like, training for real life. And here's what I found out. It's like, it's not really that different. You are in real life. I realize this is life interrupted, but this is life. It is not actually any different once you get out. You have some income and you can buy slightly better clothes, but that's a profoundly scary, but also an empowering moment. The scary part is, oh wait, if I don't know and no one else knows, are you telling me no one else knows later on? And the answer is largely yes. Like no one else knows. The hardest questions, no one knows the answers to. You have to figure them out. It doesn't matter whether you're doing it at 20 or 50. Really, it's real life. That's a scary part. What's kind of nice about it is then you're not really being like it forces you and allows you to resist the infantilizing nature of education, because you are always in training. You're always an adult in waiting. You're only preparing. And the idea is that's not true. You're already adults. You're already full human beings in some sense. You're making all the most important decisions. And whether it's deciding to pull back a little bit so that you can scale your life ambitions in a way that is going to work over the long term, or going hardcore into some things, or finding love, or leaving a bad relationship, that's life. And I just wanted to emphasize that really, and I think a lot of people who are a little bit older like me agree that that's an important thing. You're living life to its fullest, all its mistakes, all of its messiness, all of its grandeur. You're preparing, but it's not preparation for real life. It is real life. And so then you're in it, just like we're all in it.
Thank you.